Well, having looked at all the evidence you and I have just seen and tried to assess it as carefully as I can, all I can say is that for me, at any rate, the burden of proof has shifted. I began by assuming its inauthenticity until proved otherwise and asking how, as a forgery, it could possibly have been done. I now tend to assume that it's authentic and still want to know how it was done. How on earth has this image been produced on the cloth?
Of course, this question is undoubtedly the most difficult to answer.
Type of approach plays into why we must use a higher approach to the cloth of Turin,
Right.
the Holy Shroud, which I believe requires a multidisciplinary approach.
And hi, my name is Paula Gloria, and my show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. On this show, we study consciousness and how we can create our reality by better understanding who we are, the nature of our thoughts, and the nature of the reality around us that we have and the reality around us that we'd like to have. It's all about developing our awareness and our ability to comprehend new realities. One of my all-time favorite topics is the Shroud of Turin. I look upon this as a document of our extraordinary possibilities. And today I have with me an expert in this field. Dr. J.J. Hurtak is a double PhD in science, and he's going to be able to elucidate this film that I've used as a roll-in on past shows, so that we can see if we can get a glimpse using science and using our critical ability to understand an article that before has been considered only one of faith. So welcome, JJ, to this
Thank
show.
you, Paula. It's
Yes.
a great privilege to be here with you and to discuss this very important document.
Well, you have a very important life as, you know, can you just give a brief...
Right. I have a background in social science and also a background in remote sensing technology, which is the use of radar, lasers, and other technical tools.
Before you had this spiritual transformation?
Right.
You were...
Back in the early 70s, I had the opportunity to work as a consultant. I interacted with those at Jet Propulsion Lab in Los Angeles that did the Viking studies, the Mariner 9 studies, and I had the opportunity to publish some of my work, as you see here, the Mariner 9 B-frames from the early encounters with our sister planet Mars.
Well, that's interesting because wasn't Russell Targ into lasers also?
My colleague Russell Targ had an independent background at Lockheed Martin, and I'm privileged to say that he and I have recently collaborated on a new book called The End of Suffering.
Right.
So he comes from a background in the hard sciences. I come from a background in the social sciences and physics. So we both connect.
So that's why you have a double PhD. It's
right.
the social sciences and then also the hard sciences.
Correct.
Now, you had a very successful talk that you gave with Russell a few months ago here in New York.
Right, and our new book called The End of Suffering, or How to Get Out of Hell Free, quote unquote, is a look at the logic of dualism that we have in Western science, where everything is black or white. There's no middle ground, and the book highlights the work of Nagarjuna, or Nagarjuna, a Buddhist thinker from the 2nd century.
Right.
And his wonderful logic that goes into higher levels of how we can look at the whole spectrum of how we analyze life and realize that much of suffering is our own negativity of attachment and seeing things only in terms of black and white reality. So this type of approach plays into why we must use a higher approach to the cloth of Turin, the Holy Shroud, which I believe requires a multidisciplinary approach. That of psychology, remote sensing, the logic of ancient culture, history, all of this plays into the picture.
You know, multi-disciplinary to look at it, but even multi-religious. Because even though you're talking about Buddhism with your book End of Suffering, I just the other day on a call-in show was talking to the host, and actually I couldn't even get through to the screener because I wanted to talk about miracles. And the speaker was very, he had a profound connection to Jesus, and afterwards when I spoke to him after the show ended, I started to talk to him more and brought up the resurrection. And this is something I think even very adamant Christians that do even get involved in politics, making statements about our president and so on, are very hesitant to talk about what I think is the cornerstone of Christianity. And that's why I'm so interested in the Shroud of Turin, and I'm so honored to have you come here and talk about that. Ready with the roll-ins in the studio? We'll start with roll-in number 1. And this will give us
woven
an
tapestry
idea
is brought out,
of this
carried
important
as if being
Christianity.
taken from a tomb. This tradition goes back more than 1,000 years. Each tapestry is different, yet each one bears the image of Jesus laid out on a burial cloth, the body banked with flowers. The similarity to the shroud is unmistakable. Many say that this tradition of placing flowers around an image of Jesus in his shroud goes back.
That was a short little roll in there, but I guess they're working on the sound. So
Well, it's a very important touch-in to the historical film documentaries that were done on this, and also looking at the piece of cloth that Cardinal Ballestero allowed the NASA scientists and those of the U.S. Air Force Academy, Doctors Jackson and Jumper, to work with. The problem is that part of the cloth that was selected for the scientific studies was perhaps the most handled part, since it was on the edge of the cloth. And recent studies, and this is important for our discussion, those who work with the cloth covering Egyptian mummies have known that there is a coating of a carbohydrate material from 180 to 600 nanometers that covers the cloth that could distort the time factor in this. And so
for the carbon dating.
Yes, all of the carbon dating now has to be re-examined. I'm speaking now of 2006.
Okay.
Researchers are taking a look at the studies that have been done by Walter McCrone and others.
Just a second, let me slow you down because you're a scientist, to get the audience up to speed. People said that the Shroud of Turin was not authentic because the carbon dating showed that it wasn't so old. But on this roll-in that I use, the very man who invented carbon dating said, in essence, as a layman, is how I understood it, that they were carbon dating the mold that was on the fibers. So until such a time was developed where they could eliminate the mold, they can't really get an accurate read. But you may have more recent information.
Right. I was simply stating that the work of the Stirp Group, Walter McCrone and others, that were published, that was published in 3 scientific journals, has now been discounted by the work of Dr. Harry Gove, G-O-V-E, from the University of Rochester and others, who believe that we must look at the biomaterial on the surface of the cloth.
Right.
And also,
Right. Can you explain that? Because I don't know if we have the roll-in on that one.
well, it's interesting that
The
if you
three-dimensionality.
look at the cloth itself, the blood elements, scientists were interested in the we would call the bodily fluids, as well as the type of pollen that was in the cloth, of which something like 28 samples of pollen appeared in the cloth that are indigenous to the Middle East. However, the real work, I believe, was to look at the image itself, and the scientists did not have the chance to look at the image on the backside of the cloth,
Right.
nor to examine the what I call bioradiation levels that would emerge from taking into consideration the buildup of biological materials on the cloth itself. And so this skews, as it were, the tests that were done in the 1970s and puts everything back to square one.
Wow, well, you're bringing in a whole nother level than what exists on the film.
I
was
suggesting-
just thinking of the three-dimensional quality was that machine that could analyze a photograph. Like if they take a photograph of you or me and they put it under this machine, it's distorted. But somehow when they put a photograph of the shroud under this machine, and they use this to analyze things on the moon, or
It's difficult enough to believe that a medieval forgery could stand up so well to the kind of investigation we've seen already. But there is yet another characteristic of the image that only the most recent technology has been capable of detecting. Here, at the U.S. Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs, a professor of physics and a professor of engineering have coordinated an intensive research program into the nature of the image on the shroud. Dr. Eric Jumper and Dr. John Jackson.
As a scientist, when I became interested in the computer pictures sent back from the Mariner spacecraft near Mars, I thought that perhaps some of this technology could be applied to the shroud. So then when I was in Albuquerque, I started a rather modest attempt at this, and at that time I met Eric Jumper.
Well, the meeting that John refers to is about 3.5 years ago, and since that time we've made many interesting discoveries about the shroud. Right now we'd like to show you what we feel is one of the most interesting, and it involves the use of this machine. And we'd like to tell you exactly how it works. We already have 2 filters of different density lined up under the television camera that you see here. The television signal is then fed into our equipment, and you can see the filters displayed on our TV monitor.
And of course what you see are 2 squares of different shades of darkness. The television signal is processed by a VP8 image analyzer, which has the ability to translate the image patterns as adjustable levels of vertical relief on this monitor. Now watch what happens as I raise the relief. As you can see, the image intensity patterns are plotted as vertical relief in proportion to the amount of darkness that you see over here. I can also rotate the image and view it from various angles.
Now, before we put a picture of the shroud under the camera, let me show you something. I have here an ordinary photograph of myself in mess dress, one which I'm sure my mother would be very proud of. And I'm going to put this under the camera. Now, John is adjusting the gain in exactly the same way as he did with the squares. I'm sure you'll agree that even my mother would have trouble recognizing me there. Now, the reason for this is very simple. A normal photograph records only variations in light and does not record information about the distance the camera was from the subject. Now we'll put a picture of the shroud under the camera.
As you can see, unlike the photograph of Eric, this image is clearly recognizable. This can only be explained if the intensity levels of the shroud image itself are encoded with distance information from the cloth to the body.
So examine what the earlier scientific group did not do, which is the second image, which is on the backside of the cloth, showing that the light burst of radiation are completely around the molecular structure of the material of the cloth, which would indicate, as it were, a holistic type of light explosion or bioluminescence that was around this particular person, whoever he was. He was literally in a state of weightlessness.
Right.
And this was the private conversations I had with Don Lin and others at Jet Propulsion Lab later in the 1970s, who took time to re-examine the material as it was coming forth from a different perspective.
Now looking at is a image of the full body. We have an image of the front and one of the back. Of course, these are the burn marks, but what we're really interested in is the image between them. We see the head, the pectorals of the chest, the 2 arms, and the legs with one knee slightly raised. What's interesting is that the knee is not raised well above the chest or the head, but looks like it's in the correct dimensions. We see that the back also has the same characteristics, and we can even see a bit of roundedness in the calf.
When I first saw this image, I think I knew how Secunda Pia must have felt when, in 1898, he saw his photographic image. As scientists, We believe that it would be practically impossible for a forger, much less a medieval one, to have produced an image like this.
The mastery of the state of transmuting the physical garment into one of higher light or higher divine experience.
Right.
So we have here.
He wasn't really. The Bible's not saying that he was ascending at that point. That was a resurrection. That was a dead body, a beat-up body.
Yes, it's very important to state for the public record that some of the scientists believe that the bioluminescence appears around the cloth, on the cloth, after Jesus is taken off the cross, laid in the tomb, and in that state of being in the tomb, the energies were captured. And so it is an interesting interpretation, because that would be one that would be favorable to Islamic theologians who believe that Jesus did not die on the cross, but transcended in a way that was a mystery. And so here we have, as it were, the mystery of the Holy Shroud as an indication of what I believe is a higher state of consciousness transformation.
Oh, just a second, slow down. I'm still thinking about the Islamics. Would they say that a resurrection took place?
They would say, here I'm looking primarily at the historic text, such as the Quran.
The Quran.
It speaks not of the resurrection as Christians would accept it, but the fact is that Jesus was able to transcend the death experience. And this is one interpretation that could come out of recent investigations of the cloth image, which would show that this was something that was still taking place by a living, breathing person off the cross who was laid into the tomb.
But I'm thinking again, Father Mihal Ledwith, from What the Bleep Do We Know, he felt that Jesus was going through a classic process in ancient Egypt, and that the temple at Heliopolis, even though it was sort of crumbled and in disarray, it was actually built at the crown chakra of all of the temples up the Nile, and that this was the culmination of mastery, that with the power of your own Holy Spirit, you could raise yourself from the dead, and that Jesus was honored in that way after he accomplished this. So, but anyway, I guess we'd have
I would affirm what he has said, having had the experience of seeing briefly the light manifestation from the higher dimension and seeing the face of the Christ in the light manifested before my eyes, I would concur with what the ancient writers, the Coptic writers, wrote in the 2nd and 3rd century in this book, Pistis Sophia, which is now in the English text, does describe how the journey of the soul in this dimension goes through this state of incarnation, birth, transition, where death has conquered itself, and ultimately the body of the physical garment is exchanged for the garment of light, with the light body.
How did the image get onto the cloth? Much of the research into this has been done in the USA, and Dr. Robinson visited Colorado to discuss the subject with Dr. Jackson, Dr. Jumper, and also Dr. Donald Lynn, supervisor of image enhancement at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, who began by summarizing the situation surrounding accurate scientific dating of the cloth.
The original carbon-14 dating technique required a significant amount of material to make an accurate measurement. In fact, to get the accuracy we'd like, it would require a significant portion of the shroud. But there are techniques under development now that can give an accuracy of the order of plus or minus 50 years with a few square centimeters of material.
The obvious first thought, I suppose, must be that it was by human hand, by some kind of painting. What do you say to that?
Well, if it was a painting, the artist would have had to use some sort of a pigment. The most likely pigment would have been an organic one.
You mean derived from plants or animals?
Exactly. Now, I think we can rule out an organic pigment. We know the cloth was exposed to a fire, and from the damage we can tell that it probably went through a very large variation in temperature. And this would have been reflected in a change in the coloration of the organic pigment. So I think we can rule that one out. because we don't see that. And I think Don also did some work on the art.
Yeah, as part of our work, we did a frequency analysis on the image of the face. And the results of this analysis indicated that there was no directionality to the image.
You mean something like brush marks?
Yes, if it was done by a human hand, you would expect to have a preferential direction or directions, and not a random orientation as we see in our images.
Well, if it wasn't put on from the outside, could it have come from the body itself by some kind of exudation made from sort of sweat and aloes?
We know from simple experiments, for instance, if I had some blood here and laid a cloth over it, the blood would soak through the cloth. But, of course, we know that the image on the shroud is strictly a surface phenomena.
Not only that, if you tried to lay the cloth over the body and produce the image by pressing it around the body, when you straightened the cloth out, you'd end up with a greatly distorted image. And the image on the shroud is not.
So we have here an interesting aspect in the coins, because a Jet Propulsion Lab scientist saw coins under the eyelids, which is very important, pointed by the arrow. And also, if you look at the top of the head itself, the energy bursts, and what is seen on one side of the face as an interesting line that looks like the Arabic 3, or the sign of the Sheen in Hebrew.
But that's his
And then also the shroud around the neckline. All of these are important signs for what was called by the Greek teachers the Pantokrator, the one who is almighty, one who can manifest higher energies.
Well, usually coins, they usually have the respective fearless leader of whatever the civilization is. So this was showing Christ as both king and holy man. But the way I got it from the coin was it was showing that it was faithfully cast in along the lines of the shroud.
This again showed that in the early 1st and 2nd century, there was also a recognition of a state of higher transition.
Now what about the shroud as a power object? You know, some people, find this topic rather distasteful, that there's such a thing as objects that have energy. Do you believe that the shroud, it would seem if they're casting coins in the image, and that this certainly captured the imagination. They said in the film that Jesus was sent for by a king who was sick, but he was already gone and crucified, and they sent up the shroud. The king was healed, and then at Edessa it became a great center of Christian worship.
In fact, we find
it seems like there was a power object.
Edessa, we find the Gospel of Thomas, we find many of the interesting teachings of mystical Christianity, and this was King Agobard, who was healed miraculously by the shroud.
Right.
I would say, having been recently in Arles, France, and having been at the coastline of where the shroud is pictured, along with the statues of Mary Magdalene, I would say there's definitely a paraphysical dimension that comes out of the shroud that is very, very important. Even in facsimiles or in duplicates, that feeling of inner excitement is there. One is looking at the whole aspects of how the life statement is affirmed in one who is able to transmute this body into a body of light. So the message here for our audience is we're living at a time of fantastic planetary change. We're also living at a time of psychological and theological competition and possible warfare between the East, the Near East, and this holy relic or shroud, whether you accept it purely on scientific terms or paraphysical terms, could be used as an illustration of the higher ground of the Christ figure with his hands extended off the cross, reaching around the planet to embrace the planets through a higher message.
So in other words, instead of being competitive with the different religions, we really need to put our heads together to kind of unravel what the science is showing.
Exactly.
I mean, the one scientist said he could spend the rest of his life studying it.
Don Lynn told me privately, and others like Vern Miller, who were part of the original group, were so amazed by the magnificence of the cloth and the scientific realities that were there that could not be answered, certainly by anything that could be painted on the cross, something that showed a much earlier origin than the 13th, 14th century, suggesting that this indeed is a holy relic, an artifact that, along with others throughout the world, illustrates a higher state, or what I would call a fourth state of matter.
We had to the organic pigment due to the fire would not apply in this case.
Also, the fact that it's very much of a surface effect would tend to indicate that it's probably a short time scale phenomena, such as a burst of radiation.
What do you mean by a short time?
Small fractions of a second as opposed to seconds or minutes as you'd get with a diffusion process.
So you're talking about some momentary burst of energy?
That's correct, but not enough energy to destroy the cloth.
An intense burst of radiant energy scorching the cloth in a millisecond of time. Was this what caused the image on the shroud? And perhaps at one and the same time, the phenomenon Christians call the resurrection? It's a big question, but in so many ways, in the end, the shroud seems to raise more questions than it actually answers. Is it an accident that it has survived down the centuries, awaiting an age capable of unlocking some of the secrets concealed in its shadowy stains? In the words of one writer, only this much is certain. The Shroud of Turin is either the most awesome and instructive relic of Jesus Christ in existence, or it is one of the most ingenious, most unbelievably clever products of the human mind and hand on record. It is one or the other. There is no middle ground. Which is right? Who is he?